Today we're going to talk about some of the Civil War's early battles. You can see your I can statement there on the screen. I can describe 3 of the Civil War's early battles and why they are historically significant. Now, while the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter really wasn't much of a battle. The first true battle where the armies squared off and fought against each other was at the Battle of Bull Run. Once war had been declared, the newspapers in the North, especially in New York, were really kind of egging on Abraham Lincoln and the Union Army. They were saying things like, on to Richmond, trying to encourage Lincoln and the Union Army to go and try to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. Finally, they begin marching towards Richmond, and they first encountered the Confederate Army just outside Manassas, Virginia, near a small stream called Bull Run. Now remember, a lot of people thought that this was going to be a very quick war. They just thought that the Union Army was going to march down to the South, whip the Confederates, and the Confederates were going to go, okay, never mind, we don't really want to be our own country, give up and come crawling back home. So when the Union Army goes marching by, a lot of people around the area of Washington, D.C., look at it like it's a festival. They pack up picnic lunches, they go out to support the troops as they march by, and then when a lot of people hear where the battle might actually take place, they go up in the hills to watch it like it's a sporting event. But remember, we're not talking about sports or festivals or picnics or anything like that. This is a war, and these guys have guns and cannons, and they're going to shoot at each other. They're going to kill one another, and the Union Army and the Confederate Army soon realized this whole war is probably going to be much more difficult than what they had thought it would be. Now, at first, the Union Army is very successful. They very quickly break through the Confederate lines. Everybody starts, screaming from the hillsides, going, the war is over, the war is over. But then they run into General Thomas Jackson from the Confederacy. General Jackson stands his grounds. He breaks the Union. The Union is forced to retreat, and people begin shouting, "There is Jackson, standing like a stone wall." He becomes known as Stonewall Jackson, one of the most famous generals in American history, and especially during the Civil War. In the end, Bull Run just shows both sides that they need more training, that neither army is really prepared to fight a major war. The Union troops retreat out of the South. They go running away from Richmond, Virginia. Most reports say that they were scampering across the fields and through the woods, and a lot of them didn't stop running until they got back to Washington, D.C. Now, the Battle of Bull Run is the first major battle of the Civil War, and it's the last major battle for a long time. That was in July of 1861, and nothing major really happens until March of 1862. The newspapers keep reporting all is quiet along the Potomac. It almost becomes a running joke in the newspapers. They just keep repeating that headline. The Potomac is a river that runs down the east through Washington, D.C. and Virginia. McClellan proves to be a very cautious leader, and this really frustrates Abraham Lincoln. He has a very famous quote where he says, "If General McClellan is not willing to use the army, I wonder if he'd be willing to let me borrow them." When McClellan finally does try to advance into Virginia again, he once again runs into Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. He loses again, so he ends up going back to Washington, D.C. again. Now we're going to talk about the Battle of Antietam, which is the first time Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army tried to invade the North. Robert E. Lee feels like it would do a lot to help the Confederate cause and boost morale in the Confederacy if the Confederate Army can move into the North and show a victory on Northern soil. Remember, the South's plan for winning the war is that they're just hoping that eventually the North is going to lose interest and let them leave. So Lee feels like if he can defeat them on Northern soil, maybe they'll start to lose interest a little faster and think to themselves, okay, maybe we need to let them go before we lose more of the land that we already have. Unfortunately, though, one of Robert E. Lee's assistants is very careless, and he leaves some battle plans left behind wrapped around 3 cigars, and he leaves them in a campsite that the Union Army finds later. McClellan gets this information, gets very excited, and he says, well, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee now, then I'll be willing to go home and just kind of accept being fired, since a lot of people were already saying that maybe he should be fired as the general of the Union Army. At the Battle of Antietam, both sides lose a lot of soldiers. About 23,000 troops die before General Lee finally orders the retreat. Robert E. Lee was caught off guard here. He did not know that McClellan had his battle plans, so while he's still kind of marching towards Washington, D.C., he was caught off guard at Antietam, which was a town on the march to Washington, where McClellan had kind of marched out to meet him. After the victory, though, even when McClellan and the Union Army win, Lee retreats and goes back to Virginia, and McClellan doesn't chase him. He sort of gets real cautious again and starts thinking about whether or not he really wants to chase him down. Even the Confederate Army was surprised that he didn't chase. Lincoln is very disappointed in McClellan and decides to replace him. He hires General Ambrose Burnside in his place. Still, Antietam is very significant. Remember, the South wanted to fight a more defensive war, but they really felt like that if they invaded the North and could win a battle on Northern soil, it would make the North lose interest faster. They tried to do that at Antietam, but they were defeated. So, in a way that neither side really won, but the Union is able to claim victory because they made the great Robert E. Lee retreat. Even with that victory, though, the Union forces really continue to struggle in the East. They lose a couple more major battles at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson kind of move around Virginia and the East Coast area. They're just very, very difficult generals to win a battle against. They prove to be too tough for the Union Army. One night, though, near the end of the Battle of Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson is kind of in a wooded area, marching or riding his horse up to the Confederate base camp, and a couple of Confederate soldiers actually make a mistake, and they think that Stonewall Jackson is a Union soldier, so they actually shoot their own general, and Stonewall Jackson dies of what we call friendly fire. Now, the last major battle we're going to talk about is the Battle of Shiloh. This happens out west, where the Union forces were being much more successful in their attempts to gain control of the Mississippi River. There they have a general named Ulysses S. Grant, who is being very successful in trying to conquer the Mississippi. The Battle of Shiloh is a Confederate stronghold. It was one of the toughest forts in the South, and it really kind of defends along the Mississippi River. This proves to be one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, but one of the most important, because once Grant wins that, the Union Navy is able to take over New Orleans and Memphis. Then the Union has complete control of the Mississippi River, and this prevents the Confederates from using the Mississippi River to transport supplies, and it also effectively cuts the South in half by cutting off Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana. So those three states are no longer any use to the Confederacy. And that will end today's podcast, talking about the early battles of the Civil War. Make sure that you can describe those three major battles that we talked about: the Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Antietam, and the Battle of Shiloh, and explain why they are historically significant. How would the world, or how would the Civil War have been different without those three major battles?